The bells of St. Aldhelm's had been ringing for a wedding. Nobody in the parish remembered being announced. And Honora Blythe stood at the foot of the chapel steps with her father's last letter folded against her glove, listening to appeal that ought to have belonged to her. She had not been told. That was the first wrong thing, the thing her body understood before her mind would consent to it. The cold traveling up from the stones through the worn soles of her slippers into the place behind her breastbone where she kept the few certainties she still owned. A footman in unfamiliar livery passed her without a glance. A pair of matrons in good wool murmured behind their fans about how quietly His Grace had managed the whole business, how like him, how very like a man who buried his griefs in private and did his living the same way. Honora pressed the folded letter harder against the seam of her glove. She had come down from the north on the promise of a position, a governess sent for in writing by the late Duke himself before the fever took him, and she had arrived at dawn to find the gates open and the chapel full, and a name being spoken at the altar that was not the name she had expected to hear. The name was Marcus Thorne, the 8th Duke of Wycombe, and the parish had decided long before this morning what kind of man he was. He had come home from the war with a limp he never explained and a silence he never broke, and he had buried his elder brother and then his father, inside a single hard winter, and he had not danced, had not dined out, had not so much as nodded at the assembly rooms in the 2 years since. To the county he was the cold duke, the grieving duke, the man whose grief had curdled into something the matrons called pride, because pride was easier to forgive than sorrow. Honora knew none of this, yet. She knew only that the bells were wrong, and that somewhere above her in the candle-warm dark of the chapel, a marriage was being made without witnesses she could name, and that she had nowhere else in England to go. If you have ever stood outside a door that was supposed to open for you and heard it locked from the inside, stay with me. This is a story about being seen by the one person whose seeing could not be bought, and I think you will want to be there when it lands. She had been Honora Blythe of Marworth Rectory once, the eldest of a clergyman's 3 daughters, raised on Latin she was not supposed to understand, and a pianoforte her mother had kept tuned at the cost of new gloves. Her father had been a careful man and a poor one, and when the lung fever took him in the spring, he had left behind a name without money and 3 girls without a roof. The younger 2 had gone to an aunt in Bristol, who could keep 2 but not 3. Honora, being eldest and being plain and being 4 and 20, had been the one to write letters. She had written a great many. Only one had been answered, and that one in a hand grown shaky at the end, a hand she later learned belonged to the 7th Duke of Wycombe, who had known her father slightly in their shared youth, and who needed, the letter said, a steady, educated woman to take charge of a grandchild the household had not known how to reach. The terms were modest, the terms were salvation. She had spent the last of her father's coin on the coach south, and she had arrived to find her benefactor 3 weeks in the ground and his son being married in secret. On the same morning, she came to take up her place. The chapel doors opened. The bells stopped. Into the gray October light came the wedding party, and Honora, who had pressed herself back against the cold stone of the boundary wall, watched a bride descend the steps on the arm of a tall, dark man who did not look like a bridegroom at all. He looked like a man attending a duty. He wore a coat of deep navy, perfectly cut, and his face above the white cravat was still in the particular way of faces that have learned stillness as a defense. And he favored his left leg as he came down, and his eyes moved across the small crowd with the flat attention of a soldier counting a field. They found Honora. They stopped. For the length of a held breath, the cold Duke looked at the plain woman against the wall as though she were a question he had not been warned to expect, and then a voice cut across the courtyard, bright and certain, and the moment broke. The voice belonged to the bride. Lady Cordelia Vane was everything Honora was not, golden and assured and dressed in a traveling gown the color of fresh cream, and she came down the last of the steps with the ease of a woman who had never in her life stood outside a locked door. She was laughing at something. She was beautiful in the uncomplicated way the season prized, and she had the look of a woman who had won a thing she had been told all her life she deserved. Beside her, half a pace back and a great deal quieter, walked an older woman in dove gray, whose face Honora would come to know very well. This was the Dowager Marchioness of Storr, Lady Cordelia's aunt, and the architect Honora would learn of nearly everything that had brought the morning to this pass. The Dowager's eyes also found Honora against the wall, and where the Duke's gaze had held a question, the Dowager's held an immediate and effortless dismissal, the practiced reckoning of a woman who could price a gown at 30 paces and discard the wearer in the same glance. "You will be the governess," the Dowager said, not as a greeting, but as a verdict. When the party had reached the bottom of the steps and the matter of Honora could no longer be politely ignored. From the north, of course. "You had better go round to the kitchen entrance. We were not expecting you to present yourself at the chapel." She said the word governess the way another woman might say a draught from a window, a small, unavoidable discomfort to be managed and forgotten. Lady Cordelia glanced at Honora and then away, already bored. Only the Duke said nothing, and Honora, dropping the curtsy her father had drilled into her, felt his silence at her back the whole long walk around the house. To the servant's door, the way one feels a window left open in a cold room. She had been at Wycombe Hall 4 days before she understood that there were 2 women in the county who believed themselves the Duchess of Wycombe, and that both of them had found it out on the same October morning, and that she had walked into the middle of it carrying a folded letter and a trunk of mended dresses. The kitchen learned things before the drawing-room did. It was the cook, a broad, kind woman named Mrs. Pruitt, who set it out for her over the second night's supper, lowering her voice though there was no one to hear. There had been an understanding, Mrs. Pruitt said. Before the war, before the brother died, before any of it, the young master that was now his grace had given his word to a girl from the next valley, a surgeon's daughter named Eliza Fenn, a girl with no fortune and no family worth the name, but with a quickness in her that the old Duke had liked and the young master had loved. They were to have married when he came home. Then the brother died, and the father sickened, and the title fell on him like a roof, and the war had sent him back with the limp and the silence, and the Dowager Marchioness, who wanted Wycombe's consequence for her own niece, had set herself to the patient work of making the old promise impossible. "He never broke it," Mrs. Pruitt said, scraping the last of the stew toward Honora's bowl with the flat of the spoon. "That is the thing you must understand about him, miss. Whatever they say in the village, he is not cold. He is bound. He gave Eliza Fenn his word, and he is a man who would die before he broke his word. And so they could not make him break it. They had to make him think she had broken it first." The how of it came out over the following week, in pieces the way the truth of a great house always comes out sideways and below stairs. There had been letters, or the appearance of letters. There had been a story put about that Eliza Fenn had taken up with a militia officer while the Duke was at the war, that she had as good as jilted him, that she had gone away to be married herself in the spring. None of it was true. The Duke had been shown a letter in Eliza's hand, or a hand very like it, breaking the engagement on the grounds that she could not be a duchess and would not try. He had read it once and put it in his breast pocket, and not spoken of it again, and the silence the county took for pride had begun on the day he read those forged and careful lines. And so, believing himself free because the woman he loved had freed him, the 8th Duke of Wycombe had at last let the Dowager Marchioness have her way, and had agreed to marry her niece, and had set the wedding for a quiet October morning. What no one at the chapel had known, what Lady Cordelia had not known, and the Dowager had not known, and the Duke himself had not known, until a letter reached him the very night before his wedding, was that Eliza Fenn had never written the breaking letter at all. She had written, in fact, the opposite. She had written it months ago, and the letter had been intercepted, and she had spent the long silence that followed believing herself jilted in her turn, until illness and a deathbed confession from a servant who could not carry the lie any further had at last sent the truth chasing after him. The letter had come too late to stop the banns, and almost too late to stop the wedding. Almost. Honora learned the shape of all this slowly, and she learned the Duke himself more slowly still, because a governess does not converse with a duke, and the child she had been brought to teach was a silent, watchful boy of 6 named Thomas, the late brother's orphaned son, the household's heir, and the one person at Wycombe Hall who had been more alone than Honora. Thomas did not speak. And he had not spoken since his grandfather's funeral, the staff said, though he had spoken before. He had simply folded the words away one day like a man closing a drawer, and no governess sent up from London had been able to coax them out again. The Dowager Marchioness called him simple within his hearing, and arranged for him to take his meals apart so that his silence would not unsettle Lady Cordelia, who did not care for children and had said so. The Duke, Honora noticed, never called the boy anything at all. He simply stood at the nursery door, sometimes in the evening, his hand resting against the frame, watching his nephew the way Honora had felt him, watching her at the chapel, as though the child were a question he did not know how to ask. It was Thomas who first showed Honora the miniature. She had been at the hall a fortnight, long enough for the boy to have decided she was not like the others. When she came up one evening to find him sitting on the nursery floor with a small oval portrait cradled in both hands, turning it to the candlelight. It was a painting of a woman, young and dark-haired and laughing, not beautiful in Lady Cordelia's bright manner, but arresting, alive, the kind of face a painter loves. Honora did not know yet that it was Eliza Fenn. She knew only that the boy held it as though it were warm, and that when she sat down quietly on the floor beside him, he did not fold it away. He turned it toward her instead. He pointed at the painted face, and then at his own chest, and made a small sound that was not a word, but was the nearest thing to one she had heard from him. "She was kind to you," Honora said, understanding it the way one understands a thing without being told. The boy nodded. It was the first true conversation either of them had had in weeks, and it had no words in it at all. He pointed again at the painted woman, and then drew his small finger in a slow line down the side of his own face, the path a tear would take, and then he shook his head firmly, twice, as though forbidding the tears rather than describing them. Honora sat very still, and let him say it in his own grammar. She understood that the woman in the miniature had once dried this child's tears, and that somewhere in the long, cold winter of funerals, the child had decided that drying was no longer permitted, and that the silence he had folded himself into was not simplicity, whatever the Dowager called it, but a small, fierce discipline. A boy holding his grief the way a soldier holds a hurt, pressing on it so that it would not spill. She did not try to make him speak. She had been taught grief young herself, and she knew that it does not answer to coaxing. Instead, she reached into the workbag she carried, and took out the one thing of her father's she had kept, a thin volume of Psalms with his name inked inside the cover, in his careful clerical hand, and she opened it on the nursery floor between them, and began, very quietly, to read. She did not read the solemn verses. She read the one her father had liked best, the one about the mourning and the gladness that comes with it, and she read it in the ordinary voice she would have used at the rectory breakfast table, and the boy edged closer until his shoulder was against her arm and the miniature lay in his lap turned up to the candle, and the three of them, the living woman and the silent child and the laughing painted face, kept a kind of company together that the great house below would not have recognized as worth anything at all. That was the thing about the house she came to see. It was full of people who had stopped speaking, the truths that mattered most. The Duke did not speak of Eliza. Thomas did not speak at all. The Dowager spoke constantly, and said nothing real. Only Lady Cordelia seemed entirely at ease, mistress now of a great house and a great name, busy with the spending of both. And if she noticed that her new husband never came to her, never sought her company, treated her with the grave, distant courtesy of a host toward a guest who has stayed too long, she gave no sign of minding it. She had married the consequence. The man inside it had never been the point. I will step out of the story for one breath only, because what comes next turns on something small, and I want you to be watching for it. Keep your eye on the letter. Now, back to the cold October. The truth came home. The truth came home through the front door at noon on a Tuesday, in the person of a thin gray woman in a traveling cloak, who would not give her name to the footman and would not be turned away, and who said only that she carried a message for his grace that could not wait and could not be written down. Honora was crossing the upper gallery with Thomas, when she heard the commotion below the footman's protests. The cool, descending tread of the Dowager Marchioness, come to deal with whatever inconvenience had arrived. She drew the boy back against the balustrade, and they watched together through the rails, and so Honora was looking down into the great hall when the Duke came out of his study, and saw the grey woman, and she saw his face change. It changed all at once, the way ice changes when the thaw reaches it. A stillness breaking that had held so long, it had been mistaken for the shape of the man himself. The grey woman put back her hood. She was no one Honora knew. Yet the Duke crossed the hall in 5 uneven strides, his limp forgotten, and he took the woman by both hands as though she were the last solid thing in a flood, and the woman said, low, but not so low that the gallery could not catch it, "She did not write it, Marcus. She never wrote it. I have come to tell you she never wrote it, and she is asking for you, and there is not much time." The Dowager Marchioness moved then. She moved fast for a woman of her years, putting herself between the Duke and the grey woman, her voice gone bright and hard. "There was some mistake," she said. His Grace was a married man now, and could not be troubling himself with messages from persons unknown. Whatever this woman wanted, it could be dealt with through the proper channels, in the morning, by a servant. She set her hand on the Duke's arm to draw him back toward the study. And for a moment Honora thought it would work, because it had always worked, because the whole architecture of the last 2 years had been built on the Dowager's certainty that the Duke could be managed by the rules he refused to break. It did not work. The Duke looked down at the gloved hand on his arm, and then up at the Dowager's face, and he said, in a voice Honora had not heard him use, level and quiet and absolutely without mercy, "Take your hand off me." The Dowager took her hand off him. In the silence that followed, the Duke turned to the grey woman and said, "Where is she?" And it was not a question, and the woman told him. And he was gone out the front door bareheaded into the October cold, before the footman could fetch his coat, calling for a horse to be saddled, and the house he left behind him began, very quietly, to come apart at its seams. Honora did not see what passed at Eliza Fenn's bedside, in the surgeon's cottage 2 valleys over where a dying woman had spent her last strength sending the truth after the man she had been made to lose. No one saw it but the 2 of them, and it was theirs, and the story does not ask to follow him there. She heard afterward what he had carried back. Eliza Fenn had died in the small hours of the Wednesday morning, with the Duke's hand in hers, and the truth at last set straight between them, and he had ridden home through the dawn, with 2 years of misunderstanding burned to ash, and a marriage on his hands that he had made out of grief for a betrayal that had never happened. He had married Cordelia Vane, believing himself jilted. He had married her to stop the silence in his own house. And now the silence was over, and he was bound to the wrong woman by a vow he had spoken in good faith on the worst false premise of his life, and there was no undoing a marriage in England in the year of our Lord 1816. Not for grief, not for fraud, not for anything but the slow grinding machinery of a scandal that would ruin everyone it touched. He came back changed, and he came back silent, but it was a different silence now, the silence of a man taking the measure of a wall before he decides whether to go through it. Honora watched him from the edges of the household, as governesses watch, and she saw him do a strange thing. She saw him begin to court the truth, the way another man might court a woman. He sent for his solicitor from London. He sent for the surgeon who had attended Eliza. He sent most tellingly for an old clerk of the Dowager Marchioness's late husband, a man pensioned off years ago and half forgotten. And what that clerk knew when he came changed everything a second time. For the forged letter had not forged itself. Someone had taken Eliza Fenn's true letter, the one accepting the Duke, the one that would have brought him home to marry her the moment the war was done, and someone had made it disappear. And someone had written in its place the careful, cruel, lie that set him free for Cordelia Vane. That someone, the old clerk said, sitting very small and frightened in the great study with his hat turning in his hands, had been the Dowager Marchioness of Storr, who had paid him in his master's last years to do small dishonest things, and who had not thought when she did it. That a kitchen girl turned governess and a dying surgeon's daughter and a half-forgotten clerk would ever stand in a room together and make the pieces fit. She had built the whole edifice on the certainty that no one who knew the separate parts would ever meet. She had been wrong about that, as the confidently cruel so often are, and the meeting had already happened, and now it was only a matter of when the Duke chose to let her see it. He chose the Assembly Ball at Hartfield, the largest gathering of the county's consequence in the whole long autumn, the same rooms where the Dowager Marchioness had spent 2 years building Cordelia's claim and her own. He chose it deliberately. Honora understood that much from the cook, who understood it from the Duke's man, who understood it because the Duke had told him to lay out the navy coat and to see that the boy Thomas was dressed and brought, which no one could account for, because a child of 6 had no business at an assembly ball. And because the Duke had never in 2 years explained himself to anyone, Honora was brought too. That was the part she did not understand and was half afraid of. The instruction came down through the housekeeper that the governess was to attend Master Thomas at the Hartfield Assembly, and to remain with him throughout, and so Honora found herself, on a cold, bright November night, in a borrowed gown of dove gray that Mrs. Dahmer Pruitt had let out at the seams, standing at the edge of a ballroom blazing with candlelight and diamonds, holding the hand of a silent boy, watching a world she had only ever been allowed to serve. It was beautiful, and it was terrible. The orchestra played. The great room glittered. 100 candles burned in the chandeliers, and 100 more along the walls, and the light came down on bare shoulders and on jewels and on the polished floor, until the whole assembly seemed to float in a warm gold haze. And the air was thick with hothouse flowers and hot wax and the particular perfume of people who have never once worried about the cost of being warm. Honora stood with her back near the cool plaster of the wall, where the heat of the room thinned, and she felt the old familiar arithmetic begin, the reckoning of who might look at her and who would not, the long practice of making herself small enough to be allowed to remain. Lady Cordelia, radiant and pale blue, moved through the crowd as the new Duchess of Wycombe with the Dowager Marchioness at her shoulder, steering her like a pilot steering a ship into harbor, and the county bowed and the county admired, and the county had no notion at all that anything was wrong. The dismissive verdict that had met Honora at the chapel met her again here, transmuted into 100 small forms. The eyes that slid past her, the matron who asked her to fetch a glass and then looked startled to be answered in educated speech, the young buck who stepped on the hem of her borrowed gown and did not trouble to notice. The way she was at once entirely visible as an object and entirely invisible as a person. She bore it. She had borne worse. Beside her, the boy Thomas stood very straight in his small coat, his hand cold and tight in hers, and she felt him flinch each time the music swelled, and she bent down once to murmur that they need not stay past his bedtime, that she would take him up to a quiet room the moment he wished it, and he shook his head and gripped her hand harder, and she understood that he had been told something she had not, and that he meant to see it through. She kept her hand around the boy's hand, and she waited, because the Duke had wanted them here, and she had begun, without quite deciding, to trust that the Duke knew what he was about. He came late, as the highest rank may. He came in the navy coat, his face still and grave, and the room turned toward him the way a field of grass turns toward wind. He did not go to his wife. He stood inside the doorway, and he let the room see him, and then he walked, with his uneven soldier's stride, the whole length of the floor, past Lady Cordelia, who had turned toward him with a practiced smile, past the Dowager Marchioness, whose smile faltered as he passed it by, and he stopped in front of the plain governess and the silent child at the edge of the room. And in the sudden hush that fell across the assembly, he went down on one knee in front of the boy. "Thomas," the Duke said, and his voice carried, because he meant it to carry. "I have something to tell you, and I find I want to tell you in front of everyone. so that no one can ever say it was done in a corner. The boy looked at him. And debris. The whole room looked at him. The Dowager Marchioness had gone the color of ash. "Your grandfather meant to leave this house safe," the Duke said. "He meant to leave it to good people who would love you. I let it fall instead into the hands of a woman who lied to me, who stole a letter and forged another, and who married you to her niece by making me believe a good woman had abandoned me when she never did." He said it plainly, without heat, the way a man reads a verdict. A sound went through the room like wind through wheat. It was here that Honora thought she understood what he had brought her for, and she was wrong. And what she was wrong about was the largest thing of all. For the Duke rose from the boy's side, and he turned at last to the assembled county. And he did not name Honora, and he did not claim her, because the truth of the matter was that he could not, because he was a married man and would remain one, and because the wrong he had come to right was not a wrong against himself, or against the surgeon's daughter who was past all righting now, but against a silent child and a dead promise, and the simple buried fact of who at Wycombe Hall had told the truth, and who had not. He named the Dowager Marchioness instead. He laid the forgery and the theft and the long patient cruelty of it out in front of the people whose good opinion was the only fortune she had, and he let them watch her understand that it was gone. The Dowager Marchioness did not fall apart all at once. She was made of harder stuff than that. She said into the terrible quiet that this was grief talking, that his Grace had lost a person dear to him and was not himself, that no one of sense would credit such a story from such a source. And for a moment the old machinery turned, the county's instinct to side with rank and confidence against the unwitnessed and the strange. Then the Duke said the thing he had brought all the pieces here to make possible. "The clerk who copied her hand is in the next room," he said. "The surgeon who attended Eliza Fenn is beside him, and the true letter, the one she wrote me accepting me before the war was even done, is here." He drew it from his breast pocket, the worn, folded letter that Honora had glimpsed and not understood, that he had carried for 2 years believing it the false one, and that the dying woman had told him in the end was the only true thing in the whole sorry business. He did not read it aloud. He simply held it up and let the room see that it existed, and the existence of it was enough. The county is slow, but it is not stupid, and it had just watched a grieving man do the one thing grief does not do, which is to arrange its evidence in advance. Lady Cordelia, to her own great surprise and somewhat to Honora's, was the one who broke the Dowager. She had stood through the whole of it, pale and rigid, the bride who had married the consequence, and was now watching the consequence reveal itself as the wreckage of someone else's life. And when the Dowager turned to her for the loyalty that was owed, the niece looked at the aunt for a long moment and then said, in a voice quite clear, "You told me he was free, you told me he had been jilted. You stood in my mother's drawing room and you told me there was no other woman." And she gathered her pale blue skirts and walked away from the Dowager Marchioness, across the whole length of the silent ballroom, and out the terrace doors, into the November dark. And that walking away was the end of the Dowager more completely than any accusation, because the county understood it. Done ones and twos, and then in a long, low murmur to turn its back. The Dowager Marchioness of Storr left Hartfield that night and did not come back. There was no need to ruin her further. The ruin was complete, and it was her own, and it required no cruelty from anyone. She went to a sister in Bath, and the county let her go. And within a season her name had become one of those names that the well-bred do not quite mention. And that was punishment enough in a world built on being mentioned. The Duke did not gloat. Honora watched him, and there was no triumph in his face, only a great weariness, and underneath it something that might, in time, become peace. He had not won anything. The woman he loved was dead, and the woman he had married was a stranger walking out into the dark, and the only clean thing he had managed to do was to set the truth where everyone could see it, and to keep a silent boy from growing up in a house built on a lie. "You came this far with me, and I am glad of it. Stay for the rest. It is quieter than what came before, but it is the part that mends." The marriage could not be undone, but it could be lived around. And in the slow weeks that followed, it became plain that Lady Cordelia had no more wish to be tied to Marcus Thorne than he had to be tied to her. She had wanted to be a duchess. She had not especially wanted to be his. With the dowager gone and the truth out, the thing that had been built on falsehood simply began, without anyone forcing it, to dissolve. A separation was arranged, discreet and complete, lawyers in London exchanging careful letters. Lady Cordelia removing herself to her mother's house in town with a settlement that left her comfortable and free. It was not a thing the period did easily or often, but it was a thing the period could do for a duke with cause, and the cause was a matter of record now. Set out at Hartfield in front of 40 witnesses, Cordelia did not hate him. The last Honora heard, she had grown almost cordial in her letters, the way people sometimes can once they have stopped wanting the wrong thing from one another. And Honora Blythe stayed. She stayed because the boy Thomas needed her, and because there was no one else in England she belonged to, and because the Duke, who could not in honor or in law offer her anything more, had asked her quietly one evening at the nursery door whether she would consent to remain in his household for as long as the child had need of her. And she had said yes before he finished the asking. They did not speak of what was between them. There was nothing they could properly say. He was a married man, living separate from his wife, and she was his nephew's governess. And the whole weight of the period stood between them like a wall a hand thick, and they were both of them people who did not break walls, but waited at them. So they waited. They waited through the winter, and the waiting itself became a kind of language. He took to coming up to the nursery in the evenings to sit with the boy while Honora read aloud, and the three of them made, without ever naming it, the nearest thing to a family any of them had known in years. The boy began, slowly, to speak again. The first word he gave back to the world was Honora's name, and the second was the Duke's, and the Duke, who had not wept at his brother's grave or his father's, or even, Honora suspected, at Eliza's, had to turn and look out the dark window for a long moment when he heard it. The years are kinder to tell than to live. The separation became in the slow turning of the law and the longer turning of grief. The rare and quiet thing that the Church will sometimes grant when a marriage was made on a proven fraud, and it took the better part of 3 years, and a great deal of money, and the patient testimony of a clerk and a surgeon and a folded letter, and, at the end of it, Marcus Thorne was a free man, freer than he had been since before the war, and there was only one thing left in the world he wanted. He asked her in the nursery, because that was where the three of them had become whatever they were, and because the boy was old enough now to be told and to grin and to keep for once a glad secret, instead of a grievous one. He did not make a speech. He had laid out his evidence once, in a great room full of strangers, and he had no taste left for performance. He simply stood at the window with the worn miniature of Eliza Fenn in his hand, the painting the boy had shown Honora on a candlelit evening years before, and he said that he had carried this woman's memory honestly, and would always honor it, and that honoring the dead did not mean refusing the living, and that he had been 4 years learning the difference between a vow given to stop a silence and a vow a man might give, because his whole heart was in it. Then he set the miniature gently on the mantel. In the place of honor it would keep for the rest of their lives, and he turned to Honora, and used her given name as he had never once allowed himself to use it in all the careful years of waiting. "Honora," he said, "marry me not to mend anything. There is nothing left to mend. Marry me, because I have not had a day's true peace since you walked round to the kitchen door, and I am tired of pretending I do not know why." She married him in the spring, in the same chapel of St. Aldhelm's where she had once stood outside the locked door, listening to the wrong wedding. And this time the bells were rung for her and announced a fortnight in advance, and the boy Thomas stood up beside them, in a coat let out at the shoulders, because he had grown. The verse his new mother had taught him. It was a small wedding and a warm one. It was a small wedding and a warm one. The county came, because the county had long since revised its verdict, and decided that it had always known the cold Duke was not cold at all, but only waiting, which was not true, but which was the kind of untruth that does no harm. Mrs. Pruett wept into a great handkerchief. The surgeon who had attended Eliza Fenn was given the seat of honor. In the years that came after, Wycombe Hall was a house where people spoke. That was the change Honora was proudest of. Prouder even than the title she had never sought and wore lightly when she wore it at all. The boy grew up loud and clever and kind. There were other children in time, and the nursery she had once climbed to as a paid stranger became the warmest room in the house, and on winter evenings the fire was lit and the curtains drawn, and the pianoforte her husband had bought her stood open in the corner. And the small oval portrait of a laughing dark-haired woman kept its place on the mantel, where the boy who was now a young man would sometimes pause and touch it, remembering the only person who had been kind to him in the cold years before the governess came round to the kitchen door and the silence ended. On the last evening of that first married winter, Honora sat at the open pianoforte with her husband's hand resting on her shoulder and the boy asleep at last upstairs. And she played the half a phrase she had been teaching herself for weeks, and then stopped, the way she always stopped, in the same place. Because she had never been taught the end of it, and was making it up as she went, Marcus did not ask her to finish it. He only stood there in the firelight with his soldier's stillness gone soft at last, his hand warm through the wool of her gown, and let the unfinished phrase hang in the warm air of the room they had made out of the wreckage of 2 false mornings. And it was enough. It was, she thought, listening to the fire and the wind and the great quiet house, full of people who had learned again how to speak, far more than enough. If this story moved you, I hope you will carry Honora's quiet courage with you tonight, and perhaps leave a word behind for the next person who needs to hear that the world's first verdict on a woman is not the last. Thank you for staying until the end.